Ahoy and welcome back to the Blizzard podcast. Thank you for joining us for episode 3. We're delighted to share an interview with our friend Anne Strathie, which was recorded at the end of 2024 on a visit to Dundee. I'll pass you over to Kim and Anne for an introduction and for this fascinating interview. Enjoy! Anne Strathie, author of A History of Polar Exploration in 50 Objects, from Cook's Circumnavigations to the Aviation Age, was born and educated in Scotland. Her interest in polar exploration history began when she moved from London to Cheltenham, Gloucestershire, hometown of Edward Wilson, who was doctor, scientist and artist on both of Robert Scott's expeditions and favourite of his Hare discovery. Over the past 15 years, following careers in finance and in the arts and heritage fundraising, Anne has written biographies of the members of Scott's 1910 to 1913 Terra Nova expedition, including South Pole Party member Henry Birdie Bowers, then photographer and filmmaker Herbert Ponting. Her new book covers both polar regions and a crucial period of polar exploration history. Thank you so much for coming in today.
My pleasure.
We'll get on with the questions then. So, what was your inspiration to write this book, A History of Polar Exploration in 50 Objects?
Well, it grew out of my previous books, because when I was researching and writing about members of the Terra Nova expedition, I realised several things. Firstly, that polar exploration is not all about famous polar stars, as you might call them, like Nansen, Scott, Amundsen, Shackleton, and America's Robert Peary. They planned and led expeditions, but they depended on mariners, scientists, ship's doctors, cooks, artists, photographers, filmmakers, funders, and their own family members. Not to mention other expedition leaders for advice, instrument makers, and ship designers and builders. I also learned that many explorers, not least James Cook, Nansen, Amundsen, and Shackleton, either explored or planned to explore both polar regions. So rather than write another biography, I decided to explore these links, interconnections and collaborations over a key period.
Yeah, I think that's so fascinating. So you decided to write this as an object-based book, as you said. So you were mentioning there that you've chosen it over the historical narrative. Can you talk more about your choices in doing?
Yeah, I'd seen some polar exploration history books which tried to do it with both, but they tended to do it in chunks of Antarctic and another chunk of Arctic before moving forward. And I found you lost some of the interconnections. So I did a straight line through, and then around the same time as I was writing Birdie Bowers, Neil MacGregor's book came out, and I realised how powerful objects were in telling a history, that you start from the object and you move out from there, and you can talk about who made it, how it was used, which expedition it was used on, and it's also, I think, gives you either an easy access into a new subject area, something you don't know much about, or if you know something about it, you think, oh, that's a different way of looking at it. So and I've had that, it serves two purposes really. I see an object book almost like a cabinet of curiosities, that you look at something and you're intrigued by it. And through the illustrations, you can sort of create the excitement of seeing the thing for the first time. Particularly some of the photos in this are really beautiful. Yeah. And they just, even if it's something that's in an archive somewhere, you just feel you can touch it. And I think that's really important. And it makes you wonder about who made it, what it's for. Some of them you don't know what they're for initially, as well as the person who owned or used it. My publishers, the History Press, they've already done several 50 Objects books on women, and I think on the Titanic, things like that. So when I suggested this to them, they were very happy to make polar exploration history one of them as well.
So you talk about pitching to your publisher. Can you talk a little bit about the process of writing the book?
Yeah, a biography, you don't say, hey, let me explain to you about a biography. So you have to show, but for an objects book, you have to show how it would work. And it is research. Some of these objects I already knew. Terra Nova expedition, I knew quite a bit about the discovery. So, and I'd been to the Discovery ship. The Arctic stuff in particular, I didn't particularly know about. So that was a lot of research. And very like the iceberg analogy, you know, the 10% is the chapter. The other 90% is either in the footnotes, the timeline, or in your notes or your files or your head. I do find it important to go to the region so I did draw on my previous trips. In 2011, I went to Antarctica the first time, and I went to Scott's Hut. I hasten to say my publisher did not pay for any of these trips. But seeing the bunks that Birdie Bars and his friends slept in was just, I suppose that also made me the object thing. Yeah. You know, I put my photo of that in my book, as well as the historic photo, because just seeing them as they are now. Then I went to Spitsbergen because Ponting had gone to Spitsbergen, and that probably was the germ of the idea of people going to both. And the first time we went to Spitsbergen, it was on an expedition that was supposed to be led by Shackleton. But Shackleton was called away to Russia for the World War I after coming back from Endurance. But Ponting ended up going with Frank Wald and James McElroy from the Endurance. So again, that's another thing. The interconnections were bubbling around in my head from that. But for this book, the same way as I didn't really feel I could write about the polar regions going to Antarctica, I did feel that so much happens in the Weddell Sea, and that's early in the timeline. That's where they begin to wonder, is there the Antarctic continent? Because you can get to it from South America, which lots of people have gone, you know, Magellan and Drake and everybody have been around that area. So that is much better known than going a week south. You see, and I think then I thought, can't really write about the Northwest Passage. I have to say we didn't get much further than Franklin. We got stuck. We couldn't get to even as far as Franklin did. In a way, that was disappointing. But in a way, it was an object lesson. Yeah, that it is hazardous and it is difficult, and it still can be. Yeah, and I suppose the other bit with this book is some objects just worked better than others. So you knew there were certain key expeditions you had to include, and some of the searches for objects were quite specific, but there were some that you just saw out of the blue, and you knew you had to include. An example of that is the one on the front cover. We were in South Georgia and walked into the museum. I'm like, oh, it's a nice little compass, because it's quite nice to do little objects. Yeah, sometimes. So, you know, one is as big as an island, others are as small as a compass. And I saw it had been donated by Alexander Shackleton's granddaughters, so that gave it some provenance. Yes. And the fact it was in South Georgia meant that it represented the expedition of his that didn't go anywhere near South Georgia, because it was on the other side. So that was really nice object to include, because it had a lot of what I would call heft to it. And I think everybody seems to agree that it makes a great cover.
It's great.
And also, South Georgia Heritage Trust that runs the South Georgia Museum happens to be in Dundee as well.
Yes.
So that was another really nice link. And then once you've done that, I'm a great one for timelines and tables. So I had lots of tables running about the interplay between, you know, who went on more than one expedition, just background stuff to the objects. And then I did a timeline, and not every expedition is in there, but most significant ones are mentioned. Somebody will say, you know, where's so-and-so, and they may just be mentioned in passing. But I think I also had to bear in mind that this is not for an academic audience. Academics may read it and enjoy it, but it's to try and get more people with an overview. In the same way of the Discovery, you tell a bit about the before and the after.
Yeah, it's something as a museum, especially when you have a key object like the Discovery, how you eke out the rest of the stories around it, sort of thing. Yeah.
And I think that's what's nice, but, you know, as it is well, we'll talk about the discovery later, but it's right at a pivotal point in the book. Yeah.
So this is your fourth book now that's been related to polar expedition history. Obviously, we think that it's an incredibly important subject for everyone to be talking about here, but what is it about it that really gets you, that makes you want to write 4 books about the subject?
I came to the Birdie Bowers book almost by accident. There was I'm not related, but there was a slight family connection. He was from the area where my family were from. An uncle who I never met had been a big fan of his, and I had a copy of a biography that he'd been given by a mother. So it was a peripheral connection, and this was while I was sort of working part-time, coming towards retirement. So it wasn't a burning thing, but I've always wanted, I've always enjoyed travelling. And I was just carried away partly with Birdie Bowers' enthusiasm for it, and that's what made me want to go to Antarctica. When I went, I think it did underline why, if you're writing about it, you should go. And not everybody has. Some people have written about their experiences there, and people who work for BAS and so on. And there is an artist scheme and things like that. But I do think it's important that you understand, partly, as I was saying about the Frenchman thing, the equivalent of that in the Antarctic is that we landed, walked across what was a hairline crack. It was quite near the Nimrod Hut, Cheltenham's Nimrod Hut. And by the time we came back, we had to jump over the crack. Now, if people say Scott made a mistake or something should have been easy, they haven't done that.
Yeah.
So it is still a perilous place, but it's a fascinating place because it obviously legislates our weather. The weather does come from the pole, in the poles. People talk about wind coming over the Urals or over the North Pole, and they talk, lots of southwest prevailing winds. And you can tell that when you read about it. So the weather is a huge thing. I mean, it's no accident that a member of the Terra Nova expedition became the head of the meteorological office. People who go there in those days became fascinated. So many of them made their careers in it afterwards. Look at Shackleton, on and on and on. So yes, it is fascinating. I think it's also, I enjoyed looking at the visual representation of it, and I think that's an interesting sort of overlay in starting from ship's artists through photography. One of the things that really struck me that James Cook said is, I won't attempt his Yorkshire accent, but Whitby, was that he was a man's plain words, and he relied on the expedition artists to show what he couldn't describe because they had never seen it before. And when you look at some of these paintings, they're not quite that. Look what they're trying to do. It's the same as the one of James Weddell's, one of the Weddell seal. The head is tiny, but what he's trying to express is that the head almost joins the neck. It's not like other seals look like. And that's one of the things they're trying to do, the contrast between it and something else. And you see these early pictures of icebergs with huge splodges of bright blue, not little bits going through it, but, just them struggling to express it. And then you move to photography. But photography is not that sophisticated then. It's got limitations. And Herbert Ponting's precious colour plates got damaged by, or made less effective by, passing through the tropics twice on the way to Antarctica. And other films, by the time he was in the second year, had passed their expiry date, so he didn't know. And of course, it's not like now that you photo check, is it all right? And then one of my objects was, I was astonished to find there was a proto-IMAX in 1820, which was a scaled-up survey of the area north of Spitsbergen. Guy in the ship who happens that his father is a Royal Academician, very good drawer, and they make it's actually quite like Discovery Point, a huge dome, and they show it in, but this is huge, and people queue up to pay £6 to go and see it. So I found that another fascinating strand. And I've studied art history, so for me that is really interesting. And again, I think that is important, that thing, but how do you express the inexpressible? How do you communicate something to people? And Edward Wilson is at the cusp of this between photography and art. He's the only one out of them who can show the borealis in the south, because the cameras won't do it in those days. So that's another strand I find really interesting, and I think it's the fact there is an artist in residence thing. I think it still shows that that's still important.
Yeah.
The weather, the fact that there's things that we still don't know that they were looking at. And you'd have to check the magnetic pole about every month to know where it was, And, they gradually realised that the magnetism was affecting compasses. That's why they're looking for the magnetic pole, and they end up trying to survey the whole world. And then they go, it's moved 100 miles to the northeast. And they have to start all over again with the measurements. And which is why you can never say people are at the magnetic poles, because it's gone again.
So it was one of the things that prompted the International Geographical Conference to say, let's go to Antarctica. We're trying to figure out magnetism.
Yeah, it's really, And I think it is part of human knowledge. And I think the other thing that fascinates me, and I think is worth people thinking about, is the difference between the two. And particularly now, with territorial grabs going on in the Arctic. The Arctic is water with a frozen bit that the North Pole drifts around on, surrounded by inhabited countries. And some of those borderlines have changed over time. Alaska was part of Russia when all the Northwest Passage thing started. Whereas, in a way, Antarctica is protected by its location.
Yeah.
So while you've had issues about seals and whales in South Georgia, around that area, the other side of Antarctica is reasonably, but there's fishing issues there. But the Antarctic Treaty, that's interesting. There's just so many. I think that's the thing. It's not one thing. There are books about the Antarctic Treaty. There are books about this. Ponting, a friend of Ponting's, was the father of the man who brought in the Antarctic Treaty Bill. Who knew that?
You did it. I didn't.
She would gash me. But there are things like that you can never, ever quite know everything about it. So, and I think you can see that in Harry Goodsir, who's the young Scottish doctor who goes with Franklin. He wrote to his brothers saying, I'm sorry I didn't get the paper I promised you finished, but Sir John asked me to go out invited me to go out in a rowing boat to see some icebergs. And I went to the top and I checked the cellular formation, and there's blue bits running through them. So, once fascinating, always fascinating.
So Discovery is halfway through, object number 25 in your book. It's the only British exploration ship which gets featured, and it's one of only 2 ships that features in your book. So selfishly, we have to ask, what is it about Discovery that put it into the book in such a prominent place as well?
The fact that Discovery is number 25, I'm afraid, is not deliberate. I didn't put it in the middle and work back and forward, but it is pivotal. It's the end of the fracking era. They've just had the 50th anniversary of fracking leaving. There are still people alive connected with that, but they have a big geographical conference and they want to move the work forward, draw a line. The Navy wouldn't provide a ship, probably had enough of ships they lost during the Falkland searches. So it's designed from scratch for both exploration and science. Full team of scientists. Scott wasn't a scientist, but he was fascinated by it. They took advice based on Nansen's ship, the Fram, which was built for different purposes, but so it was a conscious choice that it does look slightly different. But they've also got in Dundee the availability of the expertise of people who have built ships to the ice for the whaling industry. She was also built with a view to being able to overwinter. They didn't take a full accommodation hut. It was called the Scientific Hut. Yeah. And that is the hut that becomes known as Hut Point, which is used later on the Nimrod expedition, the Terra Nova expedition. But they basically lived on the ship. And that's one of the reasons I chose it as the ship, because it's their home the whole time they're there. But unlike some previous expeditions, they're not there by accident. They're in a sheltered space and everything. Also, I think the other thing that's interesting is the hybrid nature of it. They've got a naval leader, and they've got secondees from the Navy, but not a naval ship. No. So you start introducing this hybrid of, and you can see it in all the subsequent expeditions, how much discipline there should be. Should they follow naval rules when they're in the hut? Yeah. And there are some tensions that arise from that are quite interesting, I think.
One of my favourite ones is the fact that they all had the same meal. So traditionally, the captain and the officers would have a nicer meal than the crew, but on Discovery, everyone got the same food. And just how revolutionary that would have felt for Sawat would be incredible, yeah.
Yes, and even on Terra Nova, where they are in separate quarters, partly I have to say at the men's request. I mean, they want to be able to gossip after all this. Yeah. It's not a one-way stream on that one. But they do eat together on high days and holidays and they eat the same food, just the same food, just as they did on the Discovery. So that began that sort of tradition, I think. And the other thing is the multiple sources of finance that you've got the Royal Geographical Society, you've got the Royal Institute, you've got commercial sponsors and individuals, you've got schools sponsoring sledges, Boy Scouts companies and things like that. You've got some rich individuals. And I think it's interesting looking at Scott's friendships. One of his best friends is Jean-Baptiste Charcot, one of my favourite explorers, a Frenchman. I would describe Scott as an explorer scientist and Charcot as a scientist explorer. Charcot doesn't want to go to the poles. He just wants to do science. But the two of them just got on really well, and it's a lovely friendship. And they meet to test out, after that expedition, they meet to test out sledges together. So they really are friends, which I don't think necessarily James Clark Ross, or one of the what I'd call the mariner explorers, would have necessarily done that, even though he was very interested in science. But there are certainly ones you wouldn't necessarily see that. That's one of the things that really, I think, Cook does start this crossover, because Cook became a member of the Royal Society. And he was more proud of that, even some of his other stuff, and I think that is a very interesting thing throughout this period, is the mix. They're not separate disciplines.
Yeah. So that's sort of Renaissance man being able to do lots and lots of different things, the arts and the science and everything all. Yeah. Was like
the other interesting reason for choosing Discovery is her longevity as a polar ship, because she goes, after she's been used, she goes up to the Arctic, and then she goes back to the Antarctic. And interestingly, more beloved connections and interconnections, it's under Douglas Mawson, who was a protege of Shackleton's Nimrod expedition. But Scott also suggested taking on Terra Nova. And the photographer who went both with Moss's expedition and then went on Shackleton's Endurance. So it's not just about the Discovery expedition. It's all these people who have been on her from multiple expeditions. Australians, British, everything.
Yeah, I definitely think there's something about an Antarctic bug. Like getting in this Scott job, I get to speak to a lot of people that have gone to Antarctica. And it's definitely a thing where I think you get that itch to keep coming back, and you see it in these guys, you see it in other early explorers, and even in people today. I think it's definitely still there. As I was like sort of thinking about the objects, is there like a lesser known one? Because obviously the Discovery is probably one of the bigger ones that you've got in there. But is there something that caught you by surprise that you didn't, well, maybe when thinking of putting on, but that you just absolutely loved the story and couldn't wait for other people to hear about it?
Yes, there's two in particular. And interestingly, they're in very different places. They're in quite secret places, but very different. One is a little ditty box, which is a sailor's term for a little box to put precious things in, that the sailors on Cook's ship after he died made for Mrs. Cook. And it's in the Library of New South Wales archives, not always on display, but they've got fabulous photos of it. What intrigued me about it was I had wondered how to bring women in, because my period ends just as women really get going in the early 1930s. And then you start having women going, sometimes initially as wives, that then, now you've got women leading expeditions. And I found the object, and firstly, it let me tell the chapter about Cook's last expedition when he tries to go into the Northwest Passage. So that's the beginning of that, from a different angle, because he dies in the expedition, and it worked better telling it from Mrs. Cook's standpoint and how she got the box. So that let me bring women in, and so she became the first of several women who have got objects associated with them in the book. A wide range of them, but so that was one range. And it was very nice for me that it came early, because I'd been conscious, because my publisher does a lot of women's history. I'm going, sorry, they're not really going to be a women's history. And somebody else I know is writing about women in polar regions, so I didn't want to travel that one. But it just gave me a way of doing it. And it also gave me these other roles that are so important. The other one, again, a minority. There's a couple of people of colour in the book, which again, I think people might be surprised at that period. One of them is quite famous, Matthew Henson, who went with Robert Peary on his North Pole expedition. I would say went to the North Pole with Robert Peary, but that's another story. And the other one is just an astounding thing, and it came about completely by chance. It's a little box made for a man called Cornelius Hulot. Not many people know of him.
It's a good name, though.
It's a great name, who was part of a famous Franklin search expedition under Robert McClure, who actually claimed to have done the Northwest Passage by joining the two and going out the other side. Unfortunately, he didn't do it in one ship, and because the ship went below the ice. And in the meantime, Cornelius, in one of their sledging parties, has lost most of his toes to frostbite. But they get rescued. Cornelius, by way of background, his father was captured. He came from Martinique, and he was captured during the war with Napoleon. And I don't know whether his family were freed slaves or anything like that, but he's, West Indian origin. And he's captured, prisoner of war. They realise he's a very competent sailor. And of course, the British need competent sailors during Napoleonic Wars. So he's released into the British Navy, and which lets him apply for, and his wife dies, so he can apply for his children to go to Greenwich Hospital School. And that's what Cornelius and all his siblings, including a girl, go. So the whole story is just full of, did that happen then? Yeah. Sort of time. So that, this is back in 1840s, this sort of thing. So Cornelius joins the Navy, involved in the Opium War. One of the ships gets lashed at one point for doing something wrong. But he joins this search expedition. He wants to see the world. And he loses all his toes, comes back. His ship has been rescued by a ship called the Resolute. And he comes back. They find jobs for him. So they obviously hold him in quite high esteem. He's working at Chatham docks. The ship who rescued his ship comes in for breaking up. And the carpenters are making things from it, including furniture, because it was lost to the ice, sprung free of the ice. American whalers found it, took it to America. It was refurbished, represented to Queen Victoria. So when it was being broken up, by way of gratitude, Queen Victoria asked for a desk to be made to be sent to the American president. And that's the Resolute desk that's in the White House office. And Cornelius's little wooden box, which is the object, the Cornelius Hewlett's Resolute box, is made from the same wood. Incredible.
Just that little bit of wood seems
Yeah.
so much.
And the other extraordinary thing from the story is it happens because quite a lot of people you write about don't have children because they die young. Cornelius didn't have any children, but he because he had 6 siblings, he would give a raft of great nephews and nieces. And one of them's got this box, and I got in touch with them through Ancestry.
Oh, amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. So the whole story was quite extraordinary. The nice thing is, because a lot of polar stories have quite sad endings.
Yeah.
Cornelius, despite the lack of his toes to frostbite, seems to have had just unquenchable disposition. When he retired, he got a pension, and he must have got some sort of a lump sum, I think, because he buys his first house. And he calls it Arctic Villa.
It's similar to Tom Crean calling it the South Pole Inn when he sets it.
Exactly. And he is a sort of, he's very slight actually, but he is that sort of Tom Crean disposition that he sees the bright side of it all and he survives the difficulties. And yeah, but I'd love to see them together. If you see him, would be little and large. But anyway, so that's another one I'd like people to look out for, and it's just a nice, warm-hearted story that he does survive and has a happy life. And, you know, his relatives only came across each other and they DNA testing. And they all came across each other during lockdown on the web, doing Ancestry stuff. So we're hoping we can do a bit more with that story. But yeah, that's incredible. I think Cornelius needs a bit more of a public.
And Netflix needs to get hold of it. Speaking of Netflix getting hold of things and people finding out all of this history, it does feel like there's a sort of expansion in the recent-ish past around sort of reinvigorating people understanding and being interested in polar exploration and the history of it. Do you think there's any like specific reasons or like moments that you think have really like helped bring polar exploration to the public consciousness?
I think it's been cumulative. When I was looking at doing a biography of Ernie Bowers in starting looking at it 2010, I don't think I would ever have started. Even if Neil McGregor was doing it at the same time, I don't think I'd have said, hey, I won't do Birdie's biography, I'll do a history of polar exploration, 50 objects. The public wouldn't fit the frame of reference, I don't think. The sort of people that read 100 objects books. I mean, just going through 2011, David Attenborough's Frozen Planet, which followed Life in the Freezer, and it had an accompanying open university course, which I did. And they used clips, and you learned all about the albedo factor, and which is what makes the ice melt, basically. You know, food chains and everything. And I think those courses actually raise people's awareness of quite a lot of people, if they're taking any interest, know what krill is now, for example. They know it's absolutely key in the food. You have platonic krill, no whales without them. So I think that was and Attenborough did an episode in Scott's Hut, and I think that brought it to life as well. 2012, we've obviously got the Terra Nova centenary, and also the finding of the Terra Nova off Greenland, the wreck. And then 2014 and 16, other end of the world, in Canada, they found the Erebus and Terror and wrecks, Franklin ships. And interestingly, they would not find them without the Inuit. That's what the only difference. There's population up there, but they have oral history. And again, I don't think 50 years before that we, the Canadian government, we've been attuned enough to the idea of Inuit oral history. Because John Ray knew about it.
Yeah.
But he was, the Scottish explorer, he was, he looked for Franklin and he charted things. He knew that they knew. Yeah. And that was what the trouble with Lady Franklin was. But that's another story. I do allude to it, but yeah, it is a whole story, that one. But I think that was important. I think that then led to Michael Palin's book Erebus. And every polar writer would love to sell as many books as he is still in the best-selling polar books.
Yeah.
And he's given talks on that and things like that. And once you get, David Attenborough is one sort of public figure. Michael Palin, Monty Python as well, travels with Michael Palin much more, on TV more often, that sort of thing. So that makes another big difference. Same year, you get the Netflix Terror. And that is a huge shift because it's slightly sci-fi. I mean, its direct child, if you like, is the best-selling book this year, The Ministry of Time, which is another sort of sci-fi thing. And it's done. I thought it was done very interestingly because the set pieces bits that are historical back in London planning are pretty much like a reenacted documentary. Yeah. And then you have the huge CGI polar bear. So it was, but that's got a whole, that's reached, I would say, all this Doctor Who levels fandom. And there's a thing called Terror Camp. And a lot of those people have become interested in Antarctic as well. 2019 and 22, the two attempts to find the Endurance wreck, culminating in the successful one. And that, of course, spawned the film. Yeah. And then also another new medium is Sarah Arias's first volume of The Worst Journey in the World, which is Cherry Garrard's book, which a lot of people think is, particularly Sarah Wheeler, who wrote a biography of Cherry, said is one of the best, it's one of the best books written about any expedition. She's doing that in graphic novel form. And there's a graphic novel we saw in Argentina about the attempted rescue from Elephant Island from the Chilean point of view. So there's been, it's moving into all media. We've got Netflix video, and we've now had the Endurance wreck film in the cinemas.
Yeah. And now Disney Plus as well.
Yeah. And I don't think you'd necessarily have seen that going back to 2010.
Yeah.
I think that the Scott centenary was very much quite solemn occasions, and Shackleton centenary, 2015, yes, the monument, and but by that time you've all got the endurance films. So you've just got these different media so that's the difference, and that's how you reach more people. So, and there's still a steady stream of biographies and other books, and there's things in the papers. You can get science correspondents writing about global warming. You've got the detaching ice sheets. You've got, it always fetched up in the papers. Adeli's under threat. Penguins and things like that. But on the bright side, you've got the, even if you take the sort of potential gloom of some of the environmental stuff, you've still got 60 nations now, almost, the high 50s, signed up to the Antarctic Treaty. The other thing I think is changed, possibly, the Antarctic Treaty, the collaboration between parts Canada and the Inuit that, helped find the wrecks. Everything is a collaboration. And one of the early collaborations I've done is that the other ship in the book, which is probably less known, which is ARA Uruguay, which is an Argentinian ship that around the time of discovery, but on the other side of Antarctica, either rescued or assisted explorers and scientists from Sweden. This is over a 2-year period. It was about two voyages: Sweden, Norway, Argentina, Scotland, and France.
Yeah.
How's that for? We should concentrate more on collaborations, and it's at that sharp end you get them.
Yeah.
that sort of work. Yeah, in the same way as the scientists share under the Antarctic Treaty. And interestingly, the Uruguay, before they left the area where they'd been rescuing the Swedish team, it's called Snow Hill. They left provisions at Snow Hill for anybody else to which this should happen, but they also left them a Ponant Island, which is the place that Shackleton first went. He tried to get to from the endurance wreck.
Yeah.
That was the first destination. They only changed it to South Georgia, Elephant Island afterwards, because he knew there was food there. And the reason he knew was after he came home sick from Discovery, he'd been working for the Admiralty and helped fit out the Uruguay.
Yeah, it's
So,
but it is.
yeah, and that's one of, going back to what's fascinating about it, is this interconnectivity.
And I think it's the people as well that are such rich stories and such big characters, and even the smaller characters are interesting.
And I was thinking, there's an analogy almost with football or rugby, that real football fans follow transfers and transfers of managers. So you think of the managers as the expedition leaders, and then you've got the guys all changing teams. And
I think that might be the way I have to explain to my husband, because he's football mad.
there we are. So that will representing
Fabulous. So, speaking of the Discovery, and you've spoken about the importance of going to Antarctica, and that's obviously not an accessible thing for absolutely everyone to do. It would, yeah. But Discovery is something that people can come and see.
Yeah.
So, what do you think? Why do you think it's important, if you're interested in polar history, to come to the Discovery or any other polar?
It's just lots of people want to be in a ship like that, and I think once you've been on it, and then you read a book about it tossing in the Southern Ocean, how many bruises do these guys get off in the years? It's just, we go on, some of the ferries around it, it's smaller than that. It's quite a big ship for that, those for exploration. But it's, I think, just to understand what they went through and how brave they are. It's no inconsiderable thing, and that's why when things go wrong, it's actually more surprising that things go right.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that's one of the things that some people who criticise because somebody died, or they criticise because somebody didn't reach a goal, that Amundsen is the exception, not the rule. There's very few expeditions on which nothing goes wrong, that they don't get stuck in the ice. The first overwintering in the Antarctic region was because the guy said, let's go and look at this, and they get frozen in. That's the Belgica. And they always die because the captain won't eat seal meat. Doesn't like it. Yeah. And Amundsen and Cook are on. Cook could try to get to the North Pole as well, but Amundsen is on that. And he says Cook saved their lives because he was a doctor. And he said, just said, you'll die. And things like that. It is remarkable that any of the stuff, they almost lost the Terra Nova going through the Southern Ocean. Yeah. The Southern Ocean is petrifying. I mean, I've been on it, and a storm in that, it is petrifying. And I think it is. I think we've got to remember, if we criticise them or say, I'd have done better, or Amundsen would have done better, it's a combination of your luck, the weather you've had. It changes. The weather changes. I mean, you think Scottish weather's very
Scottish weather's maybe my limit.
That's not good.
So, why do you think a book is the best way to tell these stories that we've been talking about? And what do you hope that people get out of reading the book that you've made?
Okay. Funny enough, I had an email from somebody today who's got a copy of it. And they said, I'm really loving your book because I can dig into it. And I don't think you dip into ebooks. One of the reasons I'm quite pleased that it's called a paperback, but it's got a hardish cover and flaps with lovely maps inside. It looks like a hardback, but it's lighter than that. People can take it with them. And I think there's something about turning the pages rather than flicking on a screen. The other thing about a book is it can go into a library, whether it's a school. I remember a school library going in, and quite a lot of students, I think, feel that it's not quite the same. You can't take a book out. Yeah. But it's all online. And I think that's important. I think you can, say, go back and forward within that book. I think non-fiction, it's particularly important because non-fiction has got a reference side. So, for example, I've got a timeline in the back. I've got maps in the back. So, you put the cover flap in the map while you're reading about that expedition, perhaps, something like that. So otherwise you'd have to have 2 iPads to do that. I think the colour printing, which has been very nicely done here, I think it's a beautiful book. I think yes, a nicely made book. It's not a coffee table size. Let me just explain. It's a such a medium-sized paperback. It's a medium-sized book, but it's not a huge, heavy book. And I think it's been done very high production values, so it's got the best of both worlds in a way. And I think there are people who don't buy books, but they get them out of libraries. Birdie Bowers is still borrowed. My first book from 2012 is still borrowed from libraries. Yeah. And I think that's important. I think the other thing is keeping, again, probably applies more to non-fiction. I'm not David Attenborough, and it'll be like that. But my books are all still available. One of them's through an ebook, but the others, Birdie Bowers is still in print. And I think that's important because if somebody reads this and there's a chapter about Birdie Bowers' sledge flag and they go, oh, he sounds an interesting chap, they can go and buy the book. So, yeah. And I think also probably, I would say there's still quite a lot of people who are the book generation rather than the iPad generation who are interested particularly in non-fiction subjects, whether it's general history, Roman history. I'm sure Mary Beard sells more in book form than she does in ebook form. Yeah. Especially when it's illustrated.
Oh, it's just amazing. My bookshelves are full of books that I'm on my to-be-read pile, which is massive. Yeah. What would you say was the most enjoyable part of writing this book and perhaps also the most difficult?
Hard to say. A lot of learning about the Frampton expedition because there's a lot of people out there who are specialists and you're choosing objects from it. So, but I was in touch with a lot of them, and a lot of experts were very, very kind when I was doing this book and helping me and suggesting things and so on. I think, again, as I've said, is choosing these unusual things, a daguerreotype, photographed with all its velvet and everything, showing Harry Goodser, the doctor from Fife, wet as Frankton. And he spent time at St Andrews near here, as well as in Edinburgh. And what's most difficult was probably discarding some objects. Another one had to be dropped because the photographs suddenly weren't available when I had been told they would be. So there was an emergency rewrite over the weekend because the book had already been submitted. So that's quite tense. And I'm not that keen in the last bit of editing the text, your own text, because like everybody else, I can probably spot mistakes in other people's books, but it's very difficult to do your own. So very grateful to a friend who helped out with that. But as David Wilson, who is Edward Wilson's great nephew, said, there is no book without a mistake. So, yes. But hopefully there's not too many in this one. And yeah, I hope people enjoy reading it as much as I overall enjoyed writing it, and it was very positive for me. It was a great project to do, and it's been great to see it.
I think it shows in your passion, and just the breadth of your knowledge is incredible. And I say thank you so much for sitting down and having a chat with me today. It's been really nice.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.